I've always been a bit of a thrill seeker. I'm the type who watches horror movies alone in the dark, explores abandoned buildings, and gets a kick out of urban legends. So when I first heard about the dark web, I was intrigued. The idea of an underground part of the internet where anything and everything was supposedly accessible fascinated me. I read about it, watched YouTube videos, and finally, after much debate, I decided to dive in. I want to preface this by saying I'm not an idiot. I knew the dark web was dangerous. I'd heard the stories of people stumbling onto horrible things, getting hacked, or even worse. But curiosity got the best of me. I figured if I was careful, used a VPN, and stuck to the basics, I'd be fine. I wasn't looking for anything illegal or too extreme. I just wanted to see what all the fuss was about. So one night, after a few drinks to build up some courage, I set everything up. I downloaded Tor, got my VPN running, and dove in. The first thing that struck me was how mundane it all seemed. Most of the websites I came across were just poorly designed pages, forums, and marketplaces. It was sketchy, sure, but not the nightmare people made it out to be. I browsed for a bit, not really sure what I was looking for, and eventually stumbled onto a forum that caught my attention. The title was something like Unlisted Live Feeds or something along those lines. I knew this was probably the type of site where I should turn back, but I was curious. The forum was mostly dead, just a few threads with cryptic titles and minimal replies. But one thread in particular stood out. It was titled, "Watch Them Until They Notice You." There were a few replies, most of them just links or brief comments like "creepy as hell" or "not for the faint-hearted." Against my better judgment, I clicked on the link. It took me to a blank page with a single video player in the center. No title, no description, just a live feed. The video was grainy, like it was being streamed from an old webcam or a low-quality security cam. At first, I couldn't make out what I was looking at. The camera was positioned in a dimly lit room, pointing at what looked like a living room, or maybe a small office. There was a couch, a coffee table, and a door off to the side. It looked like any normal room in any normal house, except for how quiet it was. There was no sound, no movement, nothing. I watched for a few minutes, wondering if the camera was just pointed at an empty room. Just as I was about to close the tab and move on, the door in the video slowly opened. A man walked into the room casually, like he was coming home from work or something. He didn't seem to notice the camera at all. He just walked over to the couch, sat down, and started messing around on his phone. I remember thinking how weird it was that this guy had no idea he was being watched by who knows how many people on the internet. It felt wrong to be watching him, but at the same time I couldn't look away. There was something so eerie about it. The way he went about his routine, completely unaware of the camera, gave me chills. For the next few minutes, nothing much happened. The man just sat there scrolling through his phone. Occasionally he would look up at the TV, which was out of frame, but mostly he just stared at his screen. I thought about closing the video, but then I noticed something odd. The camera angle was slowly changing. At first I thought I was imagining it, but no. The camera was definitely moving, like someone was manually adjusting it. It panned slightly to the left, then zoomed in a little closer on the man. I felt a knot form in my stomach. This wasn't just some random security camera feed. Someone was controlling the camera, watching this guy just as closely as I was. I kept watching, my heart racing a little faster now. The camera continued to zoom in until it was focused tightly on the man's face. He was still looking at his phone, completely oblivious to what was happening. Then, almost imperceptibly, the man's expression changed. He looked up, not directly at the camera, but at something in the room, something out of view. His brow furrowed, and he sat up a little straighter, like he heard something. He glanced around the room, his eyes darting from one corner to the next. The camera zoomed out slightly, as if to give a better view of the entire room. It was then that I noticed something strange in the background, a faint shadow on the wall behind him, like someone was standing just out of frame. The man must have noticed it too, because he suddenly stood up and turned around. The shadow moved and the man froze. I could see his chest rising and falling rapidly as he stared at whatever was behind him. He didn't move for what felt like an eternity. The camera stayed fixed on him, capturing every tense second. Finally, the man took a step backward toward the camera, his eyes still locked on whatever was in the room with him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, probably to call someone, but before he could, the video cut out. The screen went black. I sat there staring at my monitor, waiting for the feed to come back. But it didn't. The page refreshed itself, returning me to the forum. The thread I had clicked on was gone, like it had never existed. I scrolled through the forum, trying to find it again, but it was nowhere to be found. At this point, I was thoroughly creeped out. I closed the browser, shut down my computer, and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling in my gut. I told myself it was probably just some elaborate prank or a staged video, but something about it felt too real. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. I kept replaying the scene in my head, trying to make sense of it. I even went back on the dark web a few times, searching for that forum, but I never found it again. It was like it had disappeared. Then one night, about a week later, I got an email from an unknown sender. The subject line was blank, and the body of the email contained nothing but a single link. I hesitated for a long time before clicking on it. When I finally did, it took me to a video file. The thumbnail was just a black screen, but the file name was a string of random letters and numbers. I clicked on it and the video started playing. The quality was just as bad as the live feed I had seen before, but this time the camera was positioned in a different room. A bedroom. The bed was unmade, and there were clothes strewn across the floor. The room was dark, the only light coming from a small lamp on the nightstand. The camera was focused on the bed, where someone was lying under the covers, their face obscured by the blanket. The video was completely silent. No background noise, no movement. I watched, my heart pounding, waiting for something to happen. After what felt like an eternity, the person in the bed started to stir. They rolled over, and the blanket fell away, revealing their face. My blood ran cold. It was me. I was staring at a video of myself, lying in my own bed, completely unaware that I was being filmed. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced as I tried to figure out how this was possible. I had no recollection of this happening. The room looked exactly as it had when I went to bed the night before. The video continued to play, and I watched in horror as the door to my bedroom slowly opened. The camera angle shifted slightly, zooming in on the doorway. I saw a shadow move across the floor, and then someone stepped into the room. They were just a dark silhouette, but I could tell they were holding something in their hand, something that glinted in the dim light. The figure moved closer to the bed, and I watched as I, in the video, remained completely oblivious to what was happening. The figure stood over the bed for a few seconds, just watching before reaching down toward me. And then the video ended. I sat there, staring at the blank screen, my heart hammering in my chest. I had no idea who had sent the video or how they had gotten into my house. I immediately checked all the locks, searched every room, but everything was as it should be. There was no sign of forced entry, no indication that anyone had been inside. I wanted to call the police, but what would I tell them? That I accessed the dark web and watched someone in their house without their knowledge. I feared the consequences of it. I didn't know what to do. For the next few days, I barely slept. I kept my lights on, my doors locked, and checked my phone constantly, half expecting another email. But nothing came. I started to think I had imagined the whole thing, that maybe it was some elaborate prank or a nightmare I had convinced myself was real. But then, about a week later, I got another email. This time, there was no link, just a short message that sent chills down my spine. It was asking if I enjoyed the show. I deleted the email immediately and shut down my computer. I didn't go back on the dark web after that. I didn't even use my computer for anything other than work. I tried to put it all behind me, convince myself that it was over, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. A few weeks passed, and life slowly returned to normal. I started sleeping better, stopped obsessively checking my locks, and even started going out again. But every now and then, I would catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow moving in my peripheral vision, a reflection in a window that didn't quite belong. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was still on edge from the video, but the unease never fully went away. Then one night, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something strange. My bedroom window, which I always kept closed, was slightly ajar. I walked over to it, puzzled, and reached out to close it. But as I did, I noticed something outside, something small, shiny, and out of place. It was a camera, mounted on the wall just outside my window, pointing directly at my bed. My heart dropped. I didn't know how long it had been there, who had put it there, or what they had been recording. I ripped the camera off the wall and threw it across the room, my hands shaking. I wanted to scream to call someone, but I was too terrified to move. I never found out who was behind the camera or what they wanted. I moved out of that apartment a few weeks later, breaking my lease and leaving everything behind. I couldn't stay there, not after what had happened. I moved to a different city, changed my number, and even got a new computer. But no matter what I do, I can't shake the feeling that someone is still watching me. I don't go on the dark web anymore. I don't even like to think about it. But every now and then, I'll get a text or an email from an unknown number. They never say anything, just a blank message or a random link. I never click on them, but the fear never goes away. It's always there, lurking in the back of my mind, reminding me that no matter how careful you are, some things can never be undone. I've never been one to share much online, especially not on Reddit or Facebook, but I've been keeping this inside for too long, and I need to get it out. Maybe this will serve as a warning for others, or maybe it's just something I need to get off my chest. Either way, here's what happened. I'm not going to say exactly where I live, but let's just say I'm from a fairly big city in the Midwest. You know the type of place, urban enough that you've got a mix of people, but not so big that it's a major hub like New York or LA. I'd always been curious about the darker corners of the internet. I'm not talking about typical online crime or weird subreddits. I'm talking about the dark web, the part of the internet that isn't indexed by search engines and where anonymity reigns. I'd read stories about it, heard about the things you can supposedly find there, and I figured, why not? It's not like I was planning on doing anything illegal, just looking. I knew the basics. Tor browser, VPN, all that. I'd done my homework, read up on the risks, and thought I was prepared. The first few times I explored, it was exactly what I expected. Sketchy websites selling drugs, fake IDs, counterfeit money, that kind of thing. It was creepy, sure, but not in a way that made me want to stop. It was more like watching a horror movie. Unsettling, but you're still safe on your couch, right? Then one night I found something different. It was a simple link on a forum, buried deep in a thread that seemed half dead. No replies in months, but the link was still live. It didn't have a description, just a single word. Tapes. I clicked on it without thinking much. The site it led me to was plain. Almost like a 90s web page, just text and a few images. No flashy graphics, nothing to catch the eye. The title at the top just said, Tapes. The homepage was just a list of dates and cities, some going back years, some as recent as a few weeks ago. Each date and city had a link next to it that just said, Watch. My curiosity got the better of me. I clicked on the most recent one, Chicago, just a couple of weeks ago. The video started without any intro, just static that faded into what looked like security camera footage. It was black and white, grainy, but you could make out what was happening. The camera was positioned high up, like it was mounted on a streetlight or something, overlooking an alley. It was night, the alley dimly lit by a single flickering streetlight. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Then a figure walked into the frame, head down, hands in their pockets. They looked like they were just passing through. But then another figure appeared from the shadows. The second figure moved fast, too fast for the first to react. There was a struggle, brief but violent, and then the first figure was on the ground. I felt my stomach turn as I realized what I was watching. The second figure was doing something to the body, something I couldn't quite make out because of the camera angle. After a minute, the second figure stood up, wiped something on their pants, and walked away, leaving the body there. The video ended abruptly. No fade to black, just static again. I sat there for a moment, trying to process what I'd just seen. It felt real, too real, like I'd just watched a murder. I wanted to believe it was fake, some kind of sick snuff film meant to shock people. But something about it was too convincing. The way the person moved, the panic in the struggle, the way the second figure cleaned up afterward. It didn't feel like acting. My heart was pounding, but instead of closing the site, I found myself clicking on another link. This one was from a few months back, in Detroit. Same setup, security camera footage, an alley at night. This time there were two people from the start, a man and a woman talking under the streetlight. They seemed to know each other, but then the man pulled out a knife. The woman tried to run, but he caught her. The rest was as brutal as you can imagine. I won't go into detail, but it ended with the man dragging the body out of frame. The camera lingered on the empty alley for a while before cutting out. I should have stopped there, but I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe I was in shock, maybe it was morbid curiosity, but I kept going, clicking on link after link. Each video was the same, different cities, different victims, but always the same setup. Security footage of someone being attacked, killed, and then dragged out of sight. Sometimes the attacker would do something to the body, sometimes they'd just leave it there, but it was always quick, always efficient. By the time I stopped, I was shaking. I felt sick, horrified at what I'd seen, but what really got to me was the realization that these videos were real. They weren't just staged crimes, they were actual murders, caught on camera and uploaded for anyone to see. I closed the site, shut down my computer, and tried to pretend like it never happened. But I couldn't forget. The images kept coming back to me, especially at night. I started having trouble sleeping. Kept thinking about those alleys, those people. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see. A few days later, I decided to go back. I know how that sounds. Stupid reckless, but I couldn't help myself. I needed to know more, to understand what I'd seen. I reopened the Tor browser, navigated back to the forum, and clicked on the link again. But this time the page was gone. It wasn't just down. It was like it had never existed. I tried searching for it, using different keywords, but nothing came up. It was as if the site had been wiped from the internet. Part of me was relieved, but another part was frustrated. I'd been hoping to find some answers, some explanation for what I'd seen. But now it was just gone. I thought about reporting it, going to the police. But what would I say? That I'd been browsing the dark web and found videos of real murders? They'd probably laugh me out of the station, or worse, think I was involved somehow. I kept quiet, trying to put it out of my mind, but the nightmares didn't stop. I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye, shadows, figures that weren't there when I turned around. I knew it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but it didn't make it any easier to deal with. Then one day I got an email. It was from an address I didn't recognize, just a string of random numbers and letters, but the subject line made my blood run cold. We saw you. The email was short, just a single sentence. Don't come back. No signature, no name, just that single line. I deleted it immediately, but the damage was done. I was terrified. How had they found me? I'd been so careful. VPN, Tor, all of it. But somehow, they knew. I stopped using the dark web after that. I didn't even touch my computer for a while, too scared that they might be watching. But the fear didn't go away. Every time I went outside, I felt like someone was following me, watching me. I started taking different routes to work, avoiding alleys, staying in well-lit areas, but it didn't help. The feeling was always there, gnawing at the back of my mind. I started seeing a therapist, trying to deal with the anxiety, but it was hard to explain what I was afraid of without revealing too much. I couldn't tell them the truth, so I just talked about general fears, about feeling unsafe. It helped a little, but not enough. The worst part was that I couldn't talk to anyone about it. My friends wouldn't understand. My family would freak out, and I didn't want to drag anyone else into this mess. So, I kept it to myself, hoping that eventually the fear would fade. It's been months now, and while the anxiety has lessened, it hasn't gone away. I still think about those videos, about the people in them, about how easily it could have been me in one of those alleys. I still wonder who sent that email, how they found me, and what they meant by "don't come back." I've come to accept that I'll probably never know the answers. The dark web is a place of shadows, and once you step into those shadows, it's hard to find your way back out. I've tried to move on, to live my life like I did before, but I'm not the same person I was. There's a part of me that's always on edge, always waiting for something to happen. I don't know if I'll ever be able to shake that feeling. I've always been a tech-savvy person. Ever since I was a kid, I loved tinkering with computers, taking them apart, putting them back together, learning how they work. As I got older, I turned that passion into a career. I'm a cybersecurity consultant now, which basically means I get paid to think like a hacker and find vulnerabilities before the bad guys do. It's a good job, and I'm pretty good at it. Even though I know a lot about the darker corners of the internet, I'd never really gone deep into the dark web. Sure, I'd accessed it a few times out of curiosity, but it was always in a controlled environment, like a lab or on a machine I was willing to wipe clean afterward. I'd seen some shady stuff, but nothing too out of the ordinary, illegal marketplaces, sketchy forums, the usual. This story, though, isn't about what I saw on the dark web. It's about something that happened to me because of it, something I never expected. A few years ago, I was working on a project for a client in San Francisco. They were a tech startup, one of those companies that seem to pop up overnight, with a big idea and a lot of money behind them. They'd hired me to do a full security audit of their systems, and I was pretty deep into it when I found something that didn't sit right. It wasn't anything huge, just a small vulnerability in one of their internal applications. It was the kind of thing that could be easily fixed, but if left unchecked, it could be exploited in a way that could give someone access to sensitive data. I flagged it, reported it to the client, and they thanked me. I figured that was the end of it. But a few days later, I got an email from an anonymous address. The subject line just said, "Stop." The message was short, just a few lines telling me to drop the project and move on, that it wasn't worth my time. I'm used to getting weird messages, so I didn't think much of it. I deleted the email and kept working. The next day, I got another email. This one was more direct. It said that I've been warned to drop it or I'll regret it. Again, no signature, no name, just that. This time, I was a little more concerned, but I figured it was just someone trying to mess with me. Maybe a disgruntled employee from the client company who didn't like that I was poking around their systems. I mentioned the emails to the client, but they brushed it off, saying they hadn't heard of anyone who might do that. They assured me that they wanted the audit completed and told me to keep going. So I did. A couple of days later, I was working late in my hotel room, going over some data I'd collected, when I noticed something strange. My laptop was running slower than usual, and the fan was kicking on more than it should. I'm paranoid by nature when it comes to security. So I immediately checked to see what was going on. Sure enough, there was an unfamiliar process running in the background. It was subtle, buried deep in the system, and if I hadn't been paying attention, I might have missed it. Someone was trying to access my files remotely. I quickly disconnected from the internet, shut down the laptop, and pulled out my backup machine, a clean system I kept for emergencies like this. I spent the next few hours combing through my primary laptop, trying to figure out how they'd gotten in. Whoever it was, they were good, better than most hackers I'd encountered. They'd slipped in through a vulnerability I hadn't even known existed, and they'd done it without triggering any alarms. It was only because I'd noticed the slowdown that I caught it. That's when I started to get worried. This wasn't just some disgruntled employee. This was someone with serious skills, and they were targeting me. I reported the breach to the client, but they didn't seem as concerned as I was. They assured me they were looking into it, but I got the sense that they didn't fully grasp the seriousness of the situation. I told them I needed to take some time to secure my own systems before I could continue with the audit, and they agreed. I spent the next day wiping my laptop, setting up new security protocols, and making sure there were no lingering traces of the attacker. I also started digging into the client's company, trying to figure out who might have a reason to come after me. The more I looked, the more uneasy I became. There were connections between the client's company and several other businesses, some of which had been involved in scandals or shady dealings in the past. Nothing concrete, but enough to raise red flags. I started to wonder if I was being targeted because I'd stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see. Then, things took a darker turn. The next day, I received a package at my hotel. It was addressed to me, but there was no return address. Inside was a single item, a USB drive. There was no note, no explanation, just the drive. I knew better than to plug it into my computer, so I used a clean, isolated machine to check it out. The drive contained a single video file. I hesitated for a moment, then played it. The video was grainy, black and white, and appeared to be from a security camera. It showed the outside of my hotel, the entrance to the building. The timestamp in the corner indicated it was from the night before. I watched as a figure approached the entrance, wearing a hooded jacket. They looked around as if checking to see if anyone was watching, then walked out of frame. A few seconds later, the camera feed cut to another angle, this time showing the hallway outside my room. The same figure appeared, walking slowly down the hall. They stopped in front of my door, hesitated, then turned and walked away. The video ended there. My heart was pounding as I realized what I was seeing. Someone had been outside my room. Someone who had access to the security cameras in the hotel. This wasn't just a random hacker or some disgruntled employee. This was someone with serious resources, someone who was willing to go to great lengths to intimidate me. I packed up my things immediately and checked out of the hotel. I didn't even tell the client I was leaving. I just needed to get out of there. I drove out of the city, putting as much distance between me and that hotel as possible. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I needed to disappear for a while. For the next few days, I stayed in different motels, using burner phones and only accessing the internet through secure, isolated networks. I tried to figure out what my next move should be. Part of me wanted to go to the authorities, but I wasn't sure who I could trust. Whoever was behind this had serious connections, and I didn't want to risk exposing myself further. Eventually, I decided to reach out to a few trusted colleagues in the cybersecurity community. I didn't give them all the details, just enough to let them know I was in trouble and needed help. They helped me set up new security measures, and one of them even offered me a safe place to stay for a while. I never went back to that project. The client tried to contact me a few times, but I ignored their messages. I'd come too close to something dangerous, something that went way beyond a simple security audit. I didn't want to know any more than I already did. To this day, I'm not entirely sure what I stumbled onto. I've tried to put it behind me, but there's always a part of me that's looking over my shoulder waiting for the other shoe to drop. I've changed my name, moved to a different city, and taken every precaution I can think of to stay off the radar. But I know that if someone really wants to find me, they will. If there's one thing I've learned from this experience, it's that there are forces out there, people, organizations, that operate in the shadows, beyond the reach of law or ethics. And if you get too close to their secrets, they'll do whatever it takes to make sure you stay silent. I've read a lot of stories online about people having weird or creepy experiences, but I never really believed them. I always thought they were exaggerated or made up for attention. But then something happened to me that I can't quite shake. And it made me realize that maybe some of those stories are real after all. I live in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone and nothing much happens. It's quiet, peaceful, and I've always liked it that way. But like a lot of people, I get bored sometimes. I spend a lot of time online, browsing random forums, watching YouTube videos, and occasionally dipping my toes into the more obscure parts of the internet. I'd heard about the dark web before, but I never had a reason to check it out. It seemed too shady, too risky. But one night I was bored and curious, so I decided to see what it was all about. I did some research first, learned how to access it safely, and made sure I had all the necessary precautions in place. I knew it was risky, but I wasn't planning on doing anything illegal. I just wanted to see what was out there. After setting everything up, I started browsing. At first, it was what I expected. Lots of sketchy marketplaces, forums full of people discussing illegal activities, and other things that were disturbing but not entirely surprising. I was about to call it a night when I stumbled upon a link that caught my eye. It was in a forum thread that hadn't been updated in a while. And the link didn't have much of a description, just a vague title. Live feed. Something about it intrigued me. Maybe it was the simplicity of the post, or maybe I was just feeling reckless, but I clicked on it. The page that loaded was plain. with nothing but a black screen and a single button that said, "Watch." I hesitated for a moment, my heart racing, but then I clicked the button. The screen went black for a few seconds, and then a video feed appeared. It looked like a live stream, but there was no sound. The camera was in what seemed to be a small room, maybe a basement. It was dimly lit, and I could just make out a figure sitting in a chair in the middle of the room, their face obscured by shadows. They were tied to the chair, and from the way they were slumped over, I could tell they were unconscious, or worse. I felt a wave of panic wash over me. This wasn't what I expected. I thought maybe it was some kind of prank or a fake setup, but something about it felt too real. I wanted to close the page, but I couldn't look away. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what I was seeing. Then the camera zoomed in, focusing on the figure's face. I could see now that it was a man, probably in his 30s, with blood running down the side of his head. His eyes were closed and his chest was rising and falling slowly. He was alive, but barely. I was frozen, staring at the screen when suddenly the man's eyes snapped open. He looked directly at the camera, his face twisted in fear. He started to struggle against the ropes, but he was too weak. The camera stayed focused on him as he tried to speak, but no sound came through. I could see his lips moving, but I couldn't make out the words. Then the camera panned to the right, revealing another figure standing just out of frame. This person was wearing a mask, something plain and featureless, and they were holding something in their hand, something sharp. My stomach dropped. I didn't want to see what was about to happen, but I couldn't make myself close the window. The masked figure moved closer to the man in the chair, and I could see him trying to plead, trying to beg for his life. The figure raised the object in their hand, and that's when I finally snapped out of it. I slammed my laptop shut, my hands shaking, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I sat there in the dark, trying to calm down, trying to convince myself that it was just some sick setup, some fake stream meant to scare people. But the more I thought about it, the less sure I was. It felt too real, too raw. I couldn't get the image of that man's face out of my head, the look of pure terror in his eyes. I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about the stream, about the man in the chair, about what might have happened after I closed my laptop. I wanted to believe it was all fake, that it was just some twisted show for the dark web's audience. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. It was real, and I had just witnessed something I was never supposed to see. The next day, I tried to go about my life as usual, but I couldn't focus on anything. I was jumpy, paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder. I kept thinking about that room, about that man, and about the masked figure. I couldn't stop imagining what might have happened after I stopped watching. I wondered if anyone else had seen it, if anyone else knew what was going on, but I didn't dare go back to that site to find out. A few days later, I got an email. It was from an address I didn't recognize, and the subject line was just a single word. Seen? I almost didn't open it, but my curiosity got the better of me. The email was short, just a few words. You shouldn't have watched. No signature, no name, just that. My blood ran cold. Someone knew I had seen the stream. Someone knew I had been watching. I deleted the email, but it didn't help. I felt like I was being watched, like someone was always just out of sight, waiting. I started avoiding going out at night, staying away from dark places, but no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. It was like a weight on my chest, pressing down on me, suffocating me. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I couldn't. How would I even begin to explain it? I had stumbled onto something on the dark web, something I shouldn't have seen, and now I was paying the price. I started having nightmares, waking up in a cold sweat. The image of that man's terrified face burned into my mind. I could hear his silent pleas in my head over and over again. Weeks passed and the paranoia only got worse. I started noticing things. Small things, but enough to make me uneasy. A car parked outside my house for hours. The same people walking by my house at different times of the day. Strange noises in the middle of the night. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting my fear get the better of me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, waiting for the right moment. One night, I was walking home from a friend's house when I felt it again. That sense of being followed. I tried to stay calm, tried to convince myself it was nothing, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I quickened my pace, my heart racing. And as I turned a corner, I glanced over my shoulder. There was someone behind me, keeping their distance, but definitely following me. I didn't think. I just ran. I sprinted the rest of the way home, not stopping until I was inside, the door locked behind me. I was shaking, out of breath. But when I looked out the window, the street was empty. No one was there. I spent the rest of the night staring at the door, jumping at every little sound, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Not that night, anyway. The next day, I decided I couldn't live like this anymore. I wiped my laptop, got rid of all the software I had used to access the dark web, and even bought a new phone. I changed all my passwords, deleted my accounts on any sketchy forums I had visited, and tried to scrub any trace of myself from the parts of the internet where I might have been noticed. It felt like a desperate move, but I didn't know what else to do. The email stopped after that, and the feeling of being watched gradually faded. I still don't know if it was all in my head, if the email was just someone messing with me, or if there was really someone out there who knew what I had seen. But even now, months later, I can't forget it. I can't forget that man's face, fear in his eyes, or the masked figure standing over him. I've tried to move on, to put it behind me, but I'm not the same person I was. I'm more cautious, more paranoid. I avoid dark alleys, stay away from unfamiliar places, and I've never gone near the dark web again. I don't even like talking about it, but I felt like I needed to share this. Maybe it'll be a warning to someone else, or maybe it'll help me finally move past it. All I know is that there are things on the internet that we're not meant to see. Things that can't be unseen once you've stumbled onto them. I thought I was just being curious, just exploring something new, but I ended up seeing something I wish I could forget. If you're thinking about going on the dark web, don't. It's not worth it. There are things out there in the shadows that are better left unseen. Growing up in New York City, you get used to seeing all kinds of crazy things. People acting weird on the subway, strange noises at night. After a while, you just learn to tune it all out. But there's one thing that happened to me a couple of years ago that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. I haven't talked about it much because it's hard to explain without sounding paranoid or crazy. But I guess that's what the internet is for, right? Getting things off your chest that you can't really talk about with anyone else. I was going through a rough patch at the time. My job was getting to me. Long hours, terrible pay, the works. I needed a distraction, something to take my mind off things. And that's when I started getting curious about the dark web. I'd heard about it before, mostly in passing, and like most people, I was a little curious. What was really out there? Was it as bad as people said? I wasn't interested in anything illegal, just curious. I figured I'd poke around a bit, see what I could find, and then move on. I knew I had to be careful, though. I did some research, learned how to access the dark web safely, how to use Tor, set up a VPN, all that stuff. I wasn't planning on staying long, just enough to satisfy my curiosity. Once I felt like I had a handle on the basics, I decided to give it a try. The first few sites I visited were pretty much what I expected. Sketchy marketplaces selling drugs, fake IDs, that sort of thing. There were forums where people discussed all sorts of illegal activities, but I didn't hang around those for long. It was interesting in a morbid kind of way, but nothing really grabbed my attention. Then, one night, I stumbled across a site that was different. The link was buried deep in a forum thread that hadn't been active in months, and the description was vague, just private auctions. I don't know what I was expecting, maybe some sort of underground bidding site for stolen goods, but what I found was something else entirely. The site was simple, almost like an old GeoCities page from the 90s. No fancy graphics, just plain text on a black background. There were a few links at the top: home, auctions, contact, and below that, a list of items with dates and times next to them. The descriptions were short and to the point. Things like 10 p.m. and unlisted item. I clicked on the first auction listed for that night. The page that loaded was just as bare as the main page. But this time, there was a countdown timer ticking away in the corner, and a video feed embedded in the center of the screen. The video was black and white, grainy, like it was being filmed on an old security camera. It showed a small room, maybe the size of a large closet, with concrete walls and a single overhead light casting harsh shadows. For a few minutes, nothing happened. The room was empty, and I started to wonder if maybe the site was a dud, or if I'd just missed whatever was supposed to be happening. But then, the door at the far end of the room opened, and two men walked in. They were wearing dark clothes, their faces obscured by hoods, and they were dragging something behind them, a large, heavy-looking duffel bag. I felt a knot form in my stomach as I watched them haul the bag into the center of the room. They dropped it onto the floor with a thud, and for a moment they just stood there, looking down at it. Then one of them bent down and unzipped the bag. What happened next is still hard for me to think about. I remember leaning in closer to my screen, trying to make out what I was seeing. As the bag opened, I saw something inside. No, someone inside. It was a person, bound and gagged, curled up in the fetal position. The camera angle didn't give me a clear view of their face, but I could see them struggling, their body twitching as they tried to move. My heart was pounding at this point. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This had to be fake, right? Some kind of sick prank or a reenactment. But it didn't feel fake. It felt too real. The way the person moved, the way the men handled them, it wasn't like the stuff you see in movies. It was raw, unpolished, and terrifying. The two men started talking, but there was no audio. I could see their mouths moving, but I couldn't hear what they were saying. One of them pointed to something off camera, and the other nodded. They both stepped out of the frame for a moment, and when they came back, they were holding what looked like a large metal box. The person in the bag started thrashing harder, as if they knew what was coming. The men ignored it. They placed the box on the floor next to the bag and opened it. Inside were several tools, saws, pliers, things I couldn't quite make out. One of the men picked up a large, heavy wrench and turned back toward the person in the bag. I felt like I was going to be sick. I couldn't watch anymore. I clicked out of the site, shut down my computer, and sat there in the dark, my mind racing. What the hell had I just seen? It couldn't have been real. There's no way it could have been real, but it looked real, too real. I tried to convince myself that it was some kind of twisted performance art. Something designed to scare people like me who were dumb enough to stumble onto it. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I'd seen enough fake videos online to know the difference. What I saw on that site wasn't staged. It was a real person, and something horrible was happening to them. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that room, that bag, those tools. I kept imagining what might have happened after I clicked away, what those men did with the person they had tied up. It was too much to think about. The next day, I tried to put it out of my mind. I told myself I was done with the dark web, that I'd seen enough, and I wasn't going back. But as the day went on, I found myself thinking more and more about that site. I couldn't stop wondering what it was, who was running it, and most of all, who the hell was bidding on those auctions. By the time night rolled around, my curiosity had gotten the better of me. I know how that sounds. Stupid, reckless. But I couldn't help it. I needed to know more. I booted up my computer, reconnected to the dark web, and went back to the site. This time, the auction page was different. The list of items had changed, with new dates and times, but the setup was the same. Plain text, vague descriptions, and a countdown timer ticking away. I noticed that the next auction was set to start in just a few minutes. I waited, my stomach in knots, watching as the timer ticked down to 0. The page refreshed, and a new video feed appeared, just like before. This time, the room was different, bigger, with what looked like a metal table in the center. The camera was positioned at a different angle, giving me a better view of the whole room. For a few minutes, the room was empty. Then the door opened, and another person was brought in. This time, it was a woman, her hands tied behind her back, a blindfold over her eyes. She was struggling, trying to pull away from the two men who were holding her, but they forced her onto the table, strapping her down with thick leather belts. My hands were shaking as I watched. I knew I should click away, shut it down, but I couldn't. It was like I was frozen, unable to look away. One of the men left the room for a moment, then returned with a tray of instruments. I couldn't make out what they were, but I could tell they weren't meant for anything good. The video feed suddenly split into two, showing a second angle from the opposite side of the room. I could see the woman's face now, twisted in fear, tears streaming down her cheeks. The men started working on her, their movements precise and methodical. There was still no sound, but I could see her screaming, her body writhing against the restraints. I don't know how long I watched. It felt like hours, but it could have been just a few minutes. All I know is that at some point I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed my laptop shut and ran to the bathroom, where I threw up into the sink. I spent the next few days in a daze, barely able to function. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen, about what might be happening right now, somewhere in the world, while people like me just went about their lives, completely unaware. I thought about going to the police, but what would I tell them? That I'd been browsing the dark web and stumbled onto a snuff film. They'd either laugh me out of the station or arrest me for even being on those sites in the first place. I stopped sleeping, stopped eating. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those faces, heard those screams. I started drinking more, anything to dull the images in my mind, but it didn't help. The guilt was eating me alive. I knew there was nothing I could do to help those people, but it didn't make it any easier. After a while, I started avoiding my computer altogether. Just the thought of going online made me sick. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, that I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to see. I started noticing things, small things at first, like cars that seemed to be following me, or people staring at me a little too long in public. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was being paranoid, but it didn't help. I changed my routines, started taking different routes to work, avoiding the places I usually went. I even moved to a new apartment, hoping that would help me feel safer. But the feeling never went away. It was always there, lurking in the back of my mind. Months passed, and slowly the memories started to fade. I never completely forgot, but I managed to push it down, bury it deep where it wouldn't bother me as much. I went back to my old routines, tried to rebuild my life. But I was never the same. Something inside me had changed, something I couldn't undo. I never told anyone what happened, not really. I hinted at it to a couple of close friends, but I could tell they didn't believe me. How could they? It sounded too far-fetched, too horrible to be real. But I know what I saw. I know what happened. So why am I writing this now? I'm not really sure. Maybe I just needed to get it out, to tell someone, even if it's just strangers on the internet. Or maybe I want to warn people, to tell them to stay away from places they don't belong. The dark web is a place full of shadows, and some of those shadows are darker than you can imagine. I took a deep breath as I clicked the final link that would take me to the dark web forum I'd been searching for. My heart was racing, a mix of excitement and fear coursing through my veins. I'd heard stories about the dark corners of the internet, but I never thought I'd actually venture there myself. Yet here I was, driven by an insatiable curiosity and a desire to prove to myself that I could handle whatever I might find. The page loaded slowly, revealing a simple black background with green text. It looked like something straight out of the 90s. But I knew this site was far more current and far more dangerous. I scrolled through the forum topics, my eyes widening at the array of illegal and disturbing content being discussed so casually. One thread caught my attention: live feeds. My cursor hovered over the link as I debated whether to click it. Common sense told me to leave, to shut down my computer and forget I'd ever found this place. But a darker part of me whispered to keep going to see just how deep this rabbit hole went. I clicked. The page filled with thumbnail images, each one a grainy feed from what looked like hidden cameras. Some showed empty rooms or streets, while others displayed people going about their daily lives, completely unaware they were being broadcast to who knows how many viewers across the dark web. I told myself I was just observing, that I wasn't really doing anything wrong. But as I clicked from feed to feed, a sick feeling grew in my stomach. These were real people, their privacy violated in the most intimate ways. I saw families eating dinner, couples arguing, and even children playing in their rooms. It was a voyeur's paradise, and I felt deeply ashamed for being a part of it, even as an observer. I was about to close the browser when a new feed popped up, accompanied by a message: fresh meat in Chicago. The image showed a young woman, maybe in her early 20s, lying unconscious on a concrete floor. My blood ran cold as I realized what I was seeing. This wasn't just invasion of privacy. This was human trafficking happening in real time. I frantically searched the image for any clues about her location. The concrete walls suggested some kind of warehouse or industrial space. In the corner, I could make out a partial logo on a discarded piece of paper. My mind raced. Chicago Shipping Company. I Googled it on my phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely type. The company existed, with several warehouses scattered across the city. I had to do something. But what? I couldn't just call the police and tell them I'd stumbled across this on the dark web. I'd probably end up arrested myself. As the countdown timer ticked away, I made a decision that would change my life forever. I took screenshots of everything I could, the feed, the forum, the bidding information, and sent them to a local news station's tip line using a secure email service. I included all the information I had about the potential location, praying that someone would take it seriously. Then I cleared my browser history, shut down my computer, and tried to calm my racing heart. Had I done the right thing? Would anyone even see my tip in time? The image of that young woman's unconscious face haunted me as I paced my small apartment, jumping at every sound outside. Hours passed with no news. I obsessively refreshed local Chicago news sites, searching for any hint that my information had been useful. Nothing. As night fell, I finally collapsed into an uneasy sleep, my dreams filled with shadowy figures and muffled screams. I woke to the blaring of my phone's news alert. Bleary-eyed, I read the headline. It was about a break-in. The police raid Chicago warehouse. Multiple arrests in suspected human trafficking ring. My heart leapt into my throat. They'd found her. My tip had worked. But my relief was short-lived as I read further. The article mentioned that the tip had come from an anonymous source with inside knowledge of the operation. The police were now searching for this source, believing they might be connected to the traffickers themselves. Panic set in as I realized the gravity of my situation. I'd done the right thing, but now I was a suspect. Worse, if the real criminals discovered I'd been the one to tip off the police, my life could be in serious danger. I spent the next few days in a state of constant anxiety, jumping every time my phone rang or someone knocked on my door. I became paranoid, convinced that every stranger on the street was watching me, following me. I stopped going out unless absolutely necessary, ordering groceries online and calling in sick to work. As weeks passed with no sign that anyone had connected me to the tip, I slowly began to relax. But the experience had changed me. I couldn't shake the images I'd seen, the realization of how much darkness lurked just beneath the surface of our everyday world. I became hyper-aware of security cameras, always wondering who might be watching on the other side. I started volunteering at a local organization that worked with survivors of human trafficking, hoping to somehow make amends for my brief foray into that dark world. It helped, but I still felt the weight of what I'd seen and done. One day, as I was leaving the volunteer center, a man approached me on the street. He was nondescript, the kind of person you'd pass without a second glance. But something in his eyes made me freeze. "Nice work with the Chicago tip," he said quietly, his voice devoid of any emotion. "But you should be more careful. Some people aren't happy about losing their merchandise." Before I could react, he melted back into the crowd, leaving me standing there in shock. How had they found me? What did this mean? I spent the next few days in a state of near panic, constantly looking over my shoulder and jumping at shadows. I considered going to the police, but what could I tell them? I had no proof, just the word of a stranger on the street. I began to make plans to leave town, to start over somewhere new where no one knew me. But as I was packing my bags, a new thought struck me. Running wouldn't solve anything. These networks existed everywhere, preying on the vulnerable and hiding in plain sight. Instead of fleeing, I decided to fight back. I reached out to some of the people I'd met through my volunteer work, people with connections to law enforcement and advocacy groups. I couldn't tell them everything, but I shared what I could about the dark web forums and the networks I'd glimpsed. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I knew I'd never be able to forget what I'd seen, the horror of realizing how easily people could be bought and sold in the digital age. But maybe, just maybe, I could use that knowledge to make a difference. As the months passed, I remained vigilant, always aware that my actions might have consequences. But I also felt a sense of purpose I'd never known before. I'd seen the darkness, but I'd also seen the light. The people working tirelessly to rescue victims and bring criminals to justice. I don't know if I'll ever feel completely safe again. The dark web is vast, and those who operate there have long memories. But I've learned that there's power in shining a light on the shadows, in refusing to look away from the difficult truths of our world. Sometimes, late at night, I still find myself thinking about that young woman in Chicago, wondering what became of her after the raid. I hope she found help, that she's healing and rebuilding her life. And I hope that someday, somehow, the networks that tried to sell her will be dismantled for good. It all started when I got curious. I was always into the dark corners of the internet, but nothing too extreme. I'd scroll through subreddits about conspiracies, watch videos on abandoned places, and read up on old unsolved mysteries. But one day I came across a post on a forum about the dark web, a place where you can supposedly buy anything, including the unthinkable. I didn't believe half of what people said about it, but I was intrigued. So I decided to dig a little deep. Getting on the dark web wasn't as complicated as I thought. A quick search, a few downloads, and I was in. It felt strange, like entering a different world. The sites were simple, nothing like the sleek, colorful websites I was used to. Most of them were just text on a black background, but what they offered was far from simple. Drugs, fake IDs, stolen credit cards, you name it. It was like a virtual black market, a place where you could buy the stuff that was supposed to stay hidden. I wasn't planning on buying anything. I was just browsing, clicking around, seeing what was there. But then I stumbled upon a site that made me pause. It didn't have a name, just a string of random letters and numbers as a URL. I clicked on it out of curiosity, expecting it to be another marketplace, but this one was different. There were no products, no prices, just a list of services. The first thing I noticed was the word hitman. It felt like a punch to the gut. My heart started racing as I scrolled through the page. There were names of cities listed, and one of them caught my eye: Berlin. Underneath the city name was a list of services. The language was cold, clinical. Terms like elimination, disposal, and extraction. It didn't take long to figure out what they were offering. These were hitmen for hire operating in Berlin, Germany. I should have closed the page right then and there, but I didn't. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, maybe it was just disbelief. Whatever it was, I kept reading. The services were disturbingly detailed. Each one had a different price, depending on the complexity and the target. There were even options for making it look like an accident or a robbery gone wrong. It was sickening, but I couldn't look away. Then I made the worst mistake of my life. I clicked on one of the services. I wasn't planning on buying anything. I just wanted to see what would happen. A new page opened up, asking for details: location, time, the target's name. There was a form to fill out and a box to upload a photo. It felt unreal, like some twisted game. I stared at the screen for a few minutes, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I didn't know what I was doing, but something inside me said to keep going. I typed in a fake name and a random address in Berlin. My hands were shaking as I uploaded a photo of a random person I found on Google. It was some stock image of a businessman, the kind you see in cheesy advertisements. I hit submit, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then a message popped up. Request received. Payment instructions will be sent shortly. I stared at the screen, horrified at what I had done. I had no intention of paying or going through with it. It was just a stupid joke, a prank I pulled on myself. But something about that message made my skin crawl. I quickly closed the browser and deleted everything, my browsing history, the downloads, everything. I thought that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. A few days later, I got an email. The subject line was a string of random numbers, but when I opened it, my blood ran cold. It was a confirmation. My request had been processed. They had found the target, and they were waiting for the payment. Attached was a photo of the man I had randomly picked, but this time it wasn't the stock image. It was a real photo, taken from what looked like a security camera. He was walking down a street in Berlin, completely unaware that someone had put a hit out on him. Panic set in. I didn't know what to do. I considered going to the police, but what could I tell them? That I had stumbled upon a hitman website and put out a fake request as a joke? I doubted they would believe me, and even if they did, I'd probably end up in serious trouble. So, I did nothing. I tried to forget about it, convincing myself it would all just go away if I ignored it. But it didn't. A week later, I got another email. This one was shorter. Payment due in 48 hours. My heart pounded in my chest as I read it. They included another photo, this time of the man sitting in a cafe, unaware of the camera capturing him. The angle was perfect, like someone was watching him closely. I had no idea how they found him or how they knew I was the one who made the request. But it was clear they weren't going to let this go. I started to lose sleep. I couldn't focus on anything else. Every time I checked my email, I dreaded seeing another message. I couldn't delete them either. Something inside me was too scared to get rid of the evidence. It felt like I was being watched, even though I knew that was impossible. I was halfway across the world, nowhere near Berlin. But still, the fear was there, gnawing at me. Then, things got worse. One night, I was out with some friends, trying to forget about the whole thing. We were at a bar, and I had a few drinks, trying to numb the anxiety that had been eating away at me. My phone buzzed, and I almost ignored it, but something told me to check it. It was another email, this time with the subject line, "Final warning." I opened it, and what I saw made my blood run cold. It was a video, grainy but clear enough to see what was happening. The same man was being followed, his every move tracked by a hidden camera. The video was short, just a few seconds, but it showed him entering a building, the camera focusing on the address. It was an apartment complex in Berlin. I knew I was in deep trouble. I hadn't paid them, and they were getting impatient. But I didn't have the money. And even if I did, I wasn't going to pay for something I never wanted in the first place. I started to feel trapped, like there was no way out. The emails kept coming, each one more threatening than the last. They were demanding payment, telling me I had made a commitment, and now I had to follow through. I tried everything I could think of to make it stop. I changed my email, deleted my accounts, even got a new phone. But it didn't matter. They always found me. The messages kept coming and the threats grew more intense. I started to fear for my life, even though I was thousands of miles away from Berlin. I didn't know how they were tracking me, but it was clear they had the resources to do it. I became paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder, avoiding anyone who looked suspicious. I stopped going out, afraid that someone might recognize me. My life started to spiral out of control. I lost my job. My friends distanced themselves from me, and my family didn't know what was going on. I couldn't tell them the truth. How could I explain that I was being hunted by a hitman organization because of a stupid prank I pulled on the dark web? The final straw came when I received a package in the mail. There was no return address, just my name scrawled on the front. I opened it with shaking hands, not knowing what to expect. Inside was a single item, a photo of me, taken from behind as I walked down the street. My heart nearly stopped. The message was clear. They knew where I was, and they could reach me anytime they wanted. I knew then that I couldn't escape this. They were never going to let me go. The fear had become overwhelming, and I didn't know what to do. Every day was a nightmare, and I couldn't see a way out. The dark web had pulled me into its depths, and there was no going back. I was trapped in a web of my own making, one that I couldn't untangle myself from. Now I live in constant fear, waiting for the day they finally come for me. I've tried to go on with my life, pretending that everything is normal, but the truth is, I'm always looking over my shoulder, expecting the worst. I don't know when it will happen, but I know it's only a matter of time. The dark web doesn't forget, and it doesn't forgive. Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.